The following book, by Alexander Whyte, is Meditations upon the Writings of the Puritan Thomas Shepard. This meditation is called I Abhor Myself. Job loved himself and defended himself and exalted himself till the time came to him when he began to see and to understand something of God. But when he once saw something of God, ever after that, Job simply abhorred himself and repented every day in dust and ashes. Now, why was that? Why did the dawning sight of God produce such a deep change and such a lasting change in God's servant? It was because he now began to see something of God's great goodness, and something of the beauty of God's great holiness, and something of his essential and everlasting love, and something of his boundless grace and truth. And in all that, God's servant saw what he ought himself to have been all along, but was so far from being even in his old age. When having once seen something of God, Job turned to look at himself, from the sole of his foot even to his head. He saw himself to be full of wounds and bruises and putrefying sores. And all his self-righteousness, about which at one time he had been so eloquent, was all turned now to so many filthy rags, into that dunghill on which he sat clothed in sackcloth and ashes ever after. And as a matter of fact, all God's greatest servants in all lands and in all languages have been like God's great servant Job in all that, and in no land, and in no language more than in our own. I do not need to speak to you of David, and of Asaph, and of Heman, and of Isaiah, and of Jonah, and of Joshua, and of Peter and Paul. Ye all have by heart all that those great servants of God saw and felt and said concerning themselves in every psalm and prayer and sermon of theirs, as soon as they saw something of God and something of themselves. I will come down at once to our own land and to our own church and to our own day, and I will tell you about some men who were more or less like ourselves. John Calvin is not much given to autobiography, unless it is in his golden commentary on the Psalms. But in one place, and with all his directness, and with all his plain spokenness, and with all his loquaciousness, Calvin says that ever since he has seen God, he has seen that his own self-love has made him to be a malicious man to other men. Now, if you know what it is to be a malicious man to other men yourself, you will see that in one word how that great servant of God has made the most damning of admissions about himself. For to be a malicious man to other men is neither more nor less than to be in that a child of the devil. Myself, I am hell, said the devil himself in an outburst of autobiography when he looked up into God and then looked down into himself. But all this time the point is not about Job, nor about John Calvin, nor about the devil, but the whole point is about you and me. Well, has her self-love made you and me to be malicious to other men? The most malicious of us are not malicious at all times, and in all circumstances, and to all men. Oh no. The most malicious of us are sometimes, and to some men, as soft as butter, and as sweet as honey. For let a man be fortunate enough to be on our side. Let him pass over into our party. Let him become profitable to us. Let him be clever enough to see through us, and let him be mean enough to flatter us to the top of our appetite for praise. And we will love that man as our own soul. But let that man cease to be on our side. Let him leave our party. Let him be disgusted with our fawning hunger for his flattery. Let him in any way go against us, and then let us look up into God and down into our own hearts. Did you ever do that? I have, and I know what I'm saying. Paul also did that. And as often as he did it, he again uttered the heartbroken cry that you all know so well. Poor Paul, and poor Job, and poor John Calvin. It was his own malicious heart that made Paul a Calvinist, and it was in his own malicious heart that made Calvin a second Paul. But from their example and their experience, we are happy to learn that neither great saintliness nor great service is denied to the truly penitent, however malicious they may have found themselves out to be. And therefore neither you nor I need be wholly without hope. Take next the great Atlas of Independency, who was Calvinior Calvino, in everything but in the immaterial matter of church government. All true independents have that master in their Israel by heart, especially in what he says about himself when once he has seen something of his God and Savior, and then in that piercing light has seen something of himself. Myself, he says, is the most disingenuous and abominable principle that ever was. And where Paul says that by nature we all live in malice and in envy, hateful and hating one another, our Atlas adds to that this terrible comment of his, homo, homine, lupus. And again in this fierce, self-condemning passage, self-love is the very devil himself in us. It is the prince of the devils in us. It is the deepest root and the ultimate bottom of all our sin and all our iniquity. And to dethrone this house devil from any man's inmost heart will take all God's almighty power to do it. And with all his almighty power, he will not be able to do it wholly in this world. Yes, he exclaims against himself again, the predominant principle in us all is that we love ourselves more than we love our neighbor, or even our Maker and our Redeemer. And in this abominable self-love lies the bottom of all original sin. If you study original sin 1,000 years, and again, there is one great lust, and it is the greatest of all the rest. When holiness held the heart of man, the love of God subjected the love of a man's self unto God. But take this love of God away, and then self-love is the next heir to the throne, and it steps up immediately into the royal seat. And again in his agony over himself, the same truly Pauline man demands of all his hearers, do you know or can you imagine what multitudinous shapes this Proteus, this monster of self-love will be turned into on occasions and in circumstances? And what depths of wickedness it will sometimes be broached forth, and into what infinite varieties of operations. Look about you throughout the whole world. Read the histories of all ages, but above all, he demands, read your own heart. All rightly read independence will tell you where I have read all that and more than I have told you. It is all to be read with a broken heart, under Thomas Goodwin's index on self and self-love and self-seeking. I am not an independent in church government because I was born a Presbyterian, but I have been a lifelong student of the Atlas of that sister church, and what I owe him in the knowledge of my Savior and of myself I may have an opportunity of telling him in that land where self-love in him and in me shall have been transformed into love to God and to our neighbor for everlasting. One midnight, well on toward the end of his life, Thomas Shepard was found lying on his face in a study in a swoon of sweat and tears, and with a copy of the New England Gazette crushed together in his lock-fast hands. The reason of all that was afterwards discovered to be this. Mr. T.H., Thomas Shepard's bosom friend, was wont to have a sermon of his printed in the Gazette time, about with a sermon of Shepard's. And both the manager of the journal and all its readers were well known to Shepard, to put his friend's sermons far above his for their eloquence and for their English. It is not told how Mr. T.H. took that praise of himself and that depreciation of his friend, But Thomas Shepard made no secret to God and to his own soul how he took it. For the copy of that paper that Shepard held crushed in his hands at midnight contained a special beautiful sermon of Mr. Thomas Hooker's. And as Shepard tried first not to see that sermon, and then turned in prayer to try to read it and could not, he quite lost all power over himself and actually fell on his face on the floor, as if his New England study had been the Garden of Gethsemane. Now, unless you have fallen on your face in that same way and from that same cause, or from some similar cause, I do not want to hear your judgment on Job or John Calvin or on Thomas Goodwin or on Bishop Butler, and so on. Your day for passing a right judgment on all such men and all such manners is coming. So I both labor and hope and pray. Hold your peace, then, on this whole subject till that prostrating day comes. That day of days to you when, like all those great men, you shall see yourself to be the most to be abhorred, the most malicious, the most wolf-like, the most inwardly rent and distorted, the most hateful and the most hating, the most self-tormenting and the most shepherd-like sinner on this side of hell. And when that all-revealing day comes, I for one will submit to your judgment first on yourself, and then on all other men and all other manners, both sacred and secular. Meantime, do your best to sing and in tune with all those men the 49th paraphrase from the 5th verse, which runs thus: Love suffers long, love envies not, but love is ever kind. She never boasts of herself, nor proudly lifts the mind. The next reading in Alexander Whyte's book is called The More I Do, the Worse I Am. When Thomas Chalmers was a skirling on one occasion, he went to the village school and gave the children an elementary lesson in optical science. Taking a blackboard and a piece of chalk, he drew a long diameter on the board, and then he ran a large circumference around the diameter. And then in his own imaginative and dramatic way, turning to the children, he said to them, You must all see that the longer the diameter of light, the larger is the surrounding circumference of darkness. And in like manner, the shorter the diameter of light, the smaller is the circumference of the surrounding darkness. Now all we have to do this evening is to carry over that striking illustration from the region of mathematical and optical things to the region of moral and spiritual things, and we shall have Thomas Shepard's religious experience set before us in a way we shall never forget. The more that Thomas Shepard does, that is to say, the longer his diameter of duty done, the larger is the circumference of duty he has still to do. And the holier his heart becomes, the more sinful the remaining corruption of his heart becomes to him, till it cries out, like the holiest of men, O wretched man that I am. Our best way will be to go to Thomas Shepard himself for an outstanding instance of this painful experience of his, and this remorseful admission of his. And perhaps the best instance of all his instances is his lifelong experience of the exceeding sinfulness of his Sabbath days. Never did the most conscientious preacher do more than Shepard did to prepare himself every new week for a fruitful and a happy Sabbath, both to his people and to himself. Thomas Shepard was a hard worker both in his pastoral visitations and in his study. He took the very greatest pains in the preparation of his sermons. He had an intellectual and a spiritual people. He respected and revered his people, and he worked hard for them. It was his rule to work hard early in the week, and as a rule he had his sermons ready by 2 o'clock on Saturday afternoon. And then he gave up the whole of the Saturday evening and Sabbath morning to prepare his own mind and heart for his pulpit duties on the coming day. These are Shepard's own severe words on the subject. God will surely curse that minister who lumbers up and down the world all the week, and then thinks to prepare for his pulpit by a hurried hour or two on Saturday night and Sabbath morning. Whereas God knows Saturday night and Sabbath morning were little enough time in which to weep and to pray and to get his sinful soul into a fit frame for the approaching day. And when some young ministers came to see Thomas Shepard on his deathbed, he said to them, "Your work, remember, is a great work, and it demands great seriousness of mind on your part. For my own part," he went on, "I always sought to get good to my own soul in composing my sermons. And I always went to the pulpit as if it were my last sermon before I went to give an account of my ministry to God." Now, after all that, you would have felt sure that Thomas Shepard would always have had the best ministerial conscience in all New England, and the happiest and the sweetest of Sabbath days and Sabbath nights. But as a matter of fact, it was the very opposite of that. In all autobiography, I have never come across such sad reading as are Shepard's Sabbath night entries in a secret journal. Entry after entry is made with the sweat of an agonized conscience and with the blood of a broken heart, till I shall not attempt to tell you his terrible self-accusations all the Sabbath day and all the Sabbath night, how his first and last thought all Sabbath was himself and not God nor God's people, how he was puffed up like a born fool if he thought he had got on well in his prayers and in his sermons, and then how he was like human himself in his misery if he had not had enough eloquence and impressiveness that day in his pulpit, how he fished for his people's praise after a successful sermon, and how his heart was like dust and ashes all night if no one had flattered him. Vile, 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 he cries 1,000 times in the Sabbath night papers. His abominable self-seeking, his miserable thought of his own glory and all he did made Thomas Shepard gnash his teeth at himself, as if he were in hell. In his own words, he was in the deepest hell on many a Sabbath night. Samuel Rutherford, like Thomas Shepard, was a born preacher, but his indwelling sin in his case also poisoned all his Sabbaths and made his Anwath pulpit the greatest temptation of his much tempted life. There is a proverb to the effect that when the best things become corrupt, there you have corruption indeed. And so both Thomas Shepard and Samuel Rutherford experienced it to be in the manner of their pulpit work. Do what they would do, they could not keep the thought of themselves out of their minds, even in their most sanctified services. And that corrupted and polluted the pulpit to those two saints of God in a way, and to a degree that only a saintly and at the same time a self-seeking preacher will ever understand and believe. Rutherford often wondered in his own passionate way that he had not been eaten up of worms in his pulpit, as Herod was on his throne, and for the very same reason. The more that Thomas Shepard and Samuel Rutherford prepared for their preaching, and the more they sought God's glory while they were engaged in their preaching, the more they felt themselves to be the vilest of all men. And there was a third minister in that day of that same mind about himself. One of my best friends, writes Shepard, and one of the best men now living on the earth, has said to me that if the Lord out of his grace does not save him, he is undone forever, for his heart and his whole nature are against God. And the more he does of God's command and will, the worse he discovers his heart and whole nature within him to be. Those were three very wretched ministers, 4 counting the Apostle Paul. For as Thomas Chalmers would have said, the longer their diameter of preparation and prayer for their pulpits, the more did those 4 devoted ministers cry out every Sabbath day, "Who is sufficient for these things?" And the more their innermost hearts were cleansed clear of themselves and their self-seeking, the more did every remaining drop of themselves make them to lie on their faces before God all Sabbath night, sobbing and saying, "Oh, wretched men that we are! Who shall deliver us from this body of death?" Many more examples of the same thing crowd in upon me till I have no room for them. Take this one more instance, and this time out of our own Thomas Boston. My Sabbath day duties were enough of themselves to damn me. My Sabbath day duties must all be washed along with myself in the sin-atoning blood. The first impression on my spirit after I came down from the pulpit was my utter inability to escape from my sinfulness of heart. I saw that it was as possible for a rock to lift itself up to heaven as it was for me to raise my heart to true holiness. So says the truly holy Thomas Boston about himself. That truly great Scottish divine, says Jonathan Edwards. But my brethren, all this time and ounce of your own experience is better than a ton of testimony from other men. Now among so many now present, there must surely be some of you who know in yourselves the terrible truth of what Thomas Shepard says. There was a time, was there not, when you did not feel any sin or any guilt or any shame or any remorse, whatever you said or did? As Paul has it in his great journal of his own experience, the law of true spiritual holiness had not yet entered into your evil heart. But ever since that holy law has entered your evil heart, as the apostle says about himself, you, like him, have died. That is to say, the more you now do to fulfill that law of true holiness, the more you have to do that you can never hope to do. Nowadays, as spiritually minded Thomas Boston has it, the best thing you ever do would be enough to damn you were judgment laid to the line in righteousness to the plummet. There is so much of yourself in the best things you do, and so little of God and His glory. Jonathan Edwards, Thomas Shepard, spiritual scholar, has drawn your spiritual portrait to perfection as you now are. Quote, the more, says Jonathan Edwards, a true saint loves God with a truly gracious love, the more he desires to love Him, and the more miserable he is at his lack of love to Him. The more he hates sin, the more he desires to hate it. The more he mourns for sin, the more he longs to mourn for it. The more his heart is broken for sin, the more he prays that it may be far more broken. The more he hungers and thirsts after God, the more he faints and fails in seeking after God. Forgetting those things that are behind, he ever reaches forth to those things that are still before. He ever presses toward the far-off mark. To take a familiar instance out of your own experience, you will take up your secret cross for weeks and months, and that without a frown or a murmur, or even a sigh that any mortal ear hears. But after a long season of the sweetest submission and the most spontaneous and spiritual obedience someday, and most unaccountably to you, something happens to you and to your cross, and in a moment a great outbreak of rebellion and bitterness fills your heart. All you have suffered in the past, all you have attained to of submission and resignation in the past seems to you to have been lost in a moment. So it is often that it seemed to Paul also, and to Thomas Shepard, and to Samuel Rutherford, and to Thomas Boston, and to Thomas Chalmers. But it is not so. The truth is, it is because you have borne your cross so bravely, and have suffered under it so nobly, that the remaining dregs of your rebellion are so bitter to your sanctified heart. It is because the blessed law of resignation and submission has gone so deep into your renewed heart that the spots of sin still remaining there are so black and so bitter to bear. The diameter of your holy obedience has been so long and so beautiful that the darkness that still hangs around it is so dark and dense to you. Or again, is your besetting sinfulness not so much your rebellion at your daily cross, as say Asaph's besetting sin of envying and grieving at the prosperity of some neighboring man? Or is it a heart as dark as hell with ill will at some neighboring man? Or is it a revengeful and an unforgiving heart at some such man? Then here also the apostle's great principle comes in. The law enters, and consequently the sinfulness of your heart abounds. And here also Thomas Chalmers' blackboard illustration comes in, and in this way. The more honest delight you try to have in another man's prosperity, and the less and less ill will you try to feel towards your enemy, and the more you are able to forgive your enemy even to 70 times 7, the more you are tortured with the secret remainders of envy and malice and revenge in your heart. The longer the diameter of love, the larger the circumference of the evil feeling still remaining in your unsanctified heart. You are under that most blessed law which so orders the spiritual life that as long as any dregs of secret sinfulness still dwell in your heart, you feel as if there was nothing but a hopeless sinfulness in your heart. Like Bishop Andrews, you feel as if you were actually made of sin, as if not one atom of true holiness had ever entered into your composition at all. That is your deepest feeling about yourself, whereas the real truth is no man will ever taste what true holiness of heart is but by passing through the same experience of sin as your experience, which was the experience of Paul also, and Thomas Shepard, and Samuel Rutherford, and Thomas Boston, and Thomas Chalmers. In the experience of all such men, the holy law of God enters deeper and deeper and deeper every day, till the remaining sinfulness of their heart abounds every day. But then when such remaining sinfulness abounds, grace much more abounds. That is, your sinfulness has reigned unto your death. Even so might grace reign through righteousness unto your eternal life by Jesus Christ your Lord. Truly to see and to feel indwelling sin is the torture of all tortures, said Luther, who knew that torture by a lifelong experience of it. And yet Luther, nor any other spiritually minded man, would for one moment exchange that fearful torture, no, not for a bed of roses. The truly spiritual man lies down on his lifelong rack and actually loves it, because he believes that to him perfect and everlasting holiness of heart lies beyond it. Bear up then, O sin-tortured soul, for it is but for a moment. Bear up, because it will assuredly work in you and for you an exceeding and eternal weight of glory. You're never to be told sufferings, because of your remaining sinfulness are a sure token to you that you are far on in the way that leads and that alone leads to everlasting life. Keep up your heart then amid all your agony of heart. For eye has not seen nor ear heard what God has prepared for sufferers like you. Lifelong agony and all. You have not received a spirit of bondage again to fear, but you have received a spirit of adoption. The Spirit also bearing witness with your spirit that you are the children of God. And if children, then heirs, heirs of God, and joint heirs with Christ, if so be that you suffer with him, that you may be also glorified together. So I want to close this reading of Alexander Whyte from Meditations on the Works of Thomas Shepard. In this chapter that is called, "It is sometimes so with me that I would rather die than pray." Suppose for a moment that we had been left without hope in our fallen estate of sin and misery. Just suppose that we had been left as a race with nothing before us but a fearful looking for of judgment. And then suppose we were told that there was another race of sinful and miserable men exactly like ourselves in one of those wonderful worlds that we see in our midnight sky. And suppose we were told also that to them in their fallen state their Maker had himself become their Redeemer and had prepared his throne in the heavens, so that by simply approaching that throne they could command his ear and his heart and his hand at any hour of the day and any watch of the night. Suppose all that had been told us about those happy creatures, with what holy wonder and with what holy desire would we have gone out of our house at night and looked up to that far-off star? How would we have envied those highly favored sons of God? Oh, that my lot had been cast among them and not on this God-forsaken earth. What Sabbath days they must have up there. What communion seasons. What meetings for prayer and praise, and what family worship. How happy it must be to be a father up there. How sweet and blessed above all words to be a mother. But suppose we were also assured that with all that, those so privileged people simply despised and neglected their Maker and Redeemer, and absolutely hated so much as to kneel down before him. Suppose we were assured that 99 out of every 100 of those redeemed men actually rose up every morning and lay down every night, as if there were no God and no mercy seat. What would you have said about such men? You would have said that they must be madmen, if the 10th part of what you have been told about them is true. Now, not only is it all true, but more than that, this world of ours is that wonderful star. And we who are assembled in this house of God this Sabbath evening, we are those suicides. It is we who say, what is the Almighty that we should serve him? And what profit should we have if we pray to him? Now, if all that is so, can any explanation be given of that so fearful state of matters? A state of manners so fearful that one of the most prayerful men that ever lived here confesses to us that it is sometimes so with him that he will rather face death and judgment than abide for long before God in secret prayer? Now, can that awful state of manners be at all explained? And if so, what can that explanation by any possibility be? Well, at bottom, and to begin with, there is some absolutely unaccountable alienation of our sinful hearts away from our Maker and our Redeemer. There is some utterly inexplicable estrangement from God that has somehow taken possession of your heart and mind. There is some dark mystery of iniquity here that has never yet been sufficiently cleared up. There is some awful enmity against God as the Holy Ghost has it. Some awful malice that sometimes makes us hate the very thought of God. We hate God indeed much more than we love ourselves, for we knowingly endanger our immortal souls. Every day and every night we risk death and hell itself rather than come close to God and abide in secret prayer. This is a spiritual suicide that we could not have believed possible had we not discovered it in our own atheistical hearts. The thing is far too fearful to put into words. But put into words for once, this is what our everyday actions say concerning us in the supreme matter of prayer. No, not tonight, we say. I do not need to pray tonight. I'm really very well tonight. My heart is much steadier in its beats tonight. Besides, I have business on my hands that will take up all my time tonight. I have quite a pile of unanswered letters on my table tonight. And before I sleep, I have the novel of the season to finish, for I must send it back tomorrow morning. And besides, there is no such hurry as all that. I am not so old nor so frail as all that. Go your way for this time. When I have a convenient season, I will call for you. But even when it is not so bad with us as that, at our very best there is a certain backwardness in prayer, to which all praying men have to confess. I find that same sad confession in men so different both in their doctrine and in their experiences, Jeremy Taylor and John Newton. These are the very words of the eloquent bishop in his Holy Living. Quote, there is no worse sign of our spiritual danger than the backwardness we have to pray. So weary are we of the duty, so glad are we to have it over, and so witty are we to find an excuse to evade it, end quote. And these are the exact words of John Newton in his fine book, De Cardiphonia. Quote, I find in my own case an unaccountable backwardness to pray. I can read, I can write, I can converse with a ready will, but secret prayer is far more spiritual than any of these. And the more spiritual any duty is, the more my carnal heart is apt to start away from it, end quote. Both of these prayerful men, you see, confess to a sad backwardness in prayer, to call that state of mind and heart by no worse name. Now, in a state of manners like that, it is quite evident how next to impossible it will be for any man to put his whole heart into his prayer, even when he compels himself to pray. And yet without the whole heart it is not true prayer at all. It is only when we seek God with our whole heart that we have any assurance from him that we shall find him. The men of Judah, we read, swore to God with their whole heart. They sought God with their whole heart's desire, and he was found of them, and he gave them rest round about. And the psalmist sings of the great blessedness of them that keep God's testimonies, and that seek him with their whole heart. And again, with my whole heart have I sought thee. Let me not wander from thy commandments. And again, when you seek me with your whole heart, then you shall find me. Even the old Stoics who lived in an outside dispensation said that nothing cost them so much as the things which they purchased by prayer, because they had to give up their whole heart to their prayer before they could gain anything from God in that way. In our own New England, Thomas Shepard had this same experience in the New Testament dispensation. He wrote in his diary, August 13th, I saw that my heart was prone to neglect prayer. I soon thought that I had prayed enough for one night, till I came to see that all I could pray was little enough to help down all the mercy I needed, until I came to see also that God would have me to get my mercy from him at some cost to myself. Yes, this is one of the great difficulties of a life of prayer to such men as we are, that it demands from us our whole heart. Then again, sometimes, and to some people, there is a great difficulty they have in praying along with some other people. For instance, you will have an insurmountable difficulty sometimes to entering in with your whole heart into public worship. Your pastor does not carry you with him in his pulpit devotions. His language, his voice, his accent, his intonation, his manner, his composition, or some other unacceptableness of his to you throws you wholly out of step with him till you lose all the help of public prayer. Then again, those who conduct family prayers at home do not help you. Rather, otherwise. They are so familiar to you, they so little interest you. They are so lengthy and they so weary you, and so on. Till family worship is no worship at all to you, but the very opposite. Until you escape away from it as often as you can. Then again, and still more distressful, when a husband and his wife attempt to pray together, or a father and a son, or a mother and her daughter, their personal needs at the moment, their personal experiences at the moment are so unlike, their innermost lives are so different and so unshared, that it is impossible for them to agree together in what they ask and in the way they ask for it. Till all their attempts at united prayer only bring out the more painfully how far away they are from one another, and thus from God. So many, so real, and sometimes so absolutely unavoidable are the difficulties that lie in the way of a life of true and prevailing prayer. And once more, why do the most devout of men and the most long exercised of men sometimes so fall away from their life of prayer and from all liberty and comfort and power in prayer, and that after they have for years so enjoyed all that? Well, that is a question in personal and experimental religion that I cannot answer satisfactorily to myself as yet. I have tried hard to find out some of the reasons for that declension, both in myself and in other men, but I am not satisfied with what I have found as yet. If I succeed in my study of that painful matter, I shall tell you more about it another time. From all that, let us proceed to ask how that awful state of manners is to be met and overcome by us. For it would be too terrible to think that our dislike of prayer and our neglect of God is to go on till death, until we are suddenly summoned to give an account of our life of prayer, as of all else. Well, for one thing, I thought on my ways as a devout and much experienced psalmist, and I turn my feet into your testimonies. Let us be like him in this manner of prayer. Let us think on our ways in prayer. Let us think on the place that prayer holds in Holy Scripture, and on the place that prayer has always held in the lives of all God's outstanding people. Let us think of the urgency and the grace of God's commands laid on us to live a life of prayer. Let us think that the Almighty is actually waiting for us to begin to pray in order that he may begin to be gracious to us in our prayers. Let us think how we must look in his eyes in this manner of prayer. Let us think what he must think and say to himself about us. Let us think if we were in his place, what we would think of any who treated us and our Son as we treat him and his Son. We cannot fail to cry to God for the spirit of grace and of supplication, if we would only begin to think who and what he is, and who and what we are, and what prayer is appointed by him to be between him and us. In the diary of Thomas Shepard, July 2nd, quote, I saw it to be my duty not only to pray from time to time, but actually to live by prayer. To live by prayer for myself and for my family and for my church. And I saw that my heart was at last conformed to the mind and the will of God in that respect. And I went on to consider in what ways I might henceforth live by prayer alone. Pray often, says Jeremy Taylor, and you will pray oftener, till you will end in praying without ceasing. Again, always make hay when the sun shines. As thus, and the Lord ascended and proclaimed the name of the Lord. And when Moses heard the name of the Lord, he made haste and bowed his head to the earth and worshipped God and said, If now I have found grace in your sight, pardon our sin and our iniquity, and take us for your inheritance. Yes, make haste to make hay when the sun shines. Again, if you are an experienced man in these spiritual matters, you will be able to turn both your past transgression and your present temptations to your greater prosperity in the life of prayer. My sin is ever before me, said David, when he was engaged on the composition of his greatest psalm. I am always sinning, said Luther, and I'm always reading the epistle to the Romans, and I'm always praying. And again, when you ask the advice of the old experts in this matter, they will all tell you to set apart a special time for prayer and even a special place. James Durham, the laird of Porry Castle, gave himself much to spiritual reading, and this caused him to build a study for himself on the head of the stair in a house in the country, 3 miles out the Forfarshire road on the way out of Dundee. In this little chamber, that great scholar, that great divine and great saint, gave himself continually to reading and meditation and prayer, and he was so close a student that he often forgot to eat his bread, even after his servant had set it on his table. Like Durham, the New England fathers were wont to build their houses with a secret room for secret prayer, and Thomas Shepard looked on it as a sure sign of declension when the New England architects got no orders to put such secret rooms in their plans for new houses. Speaking about secret rooms and secret prayers, a friend of mine has this devotional device put up on his most shut-in wall. He has a long picture frame with the portraits of all his family fixed into the frame from the oldest to the youngest. And then hanging above that frame he has a fine head of Jesus Christ, which is so hung that the intercessor looks down night and day on the children's portraits below, as if he were making continual intercession for them, and indeed he is. And instead of that standing in room of his own secret prayer for his children, and thus discharging him from it as we might think the danger was, my friend assures me that the sight of that wall night and morning draws him down to his knees, when but for that reminding and quickening wall he would often forget to pray. You might try some such device yourselves, as many of you as have had a bad conscience both toward God and toward your children in this manner of secret and intercessory prayer in their behalf. What are these, and whence came they? These are they who were born and brought up in a baptized home, but were never prayed for, to call prayer, and were never taught to pray for themselves. They took a high place at school and at college, but they were never taught to pray. Their fathers and their mothers were church members, but they never took the trouble to teach their children to pray. And when they became fathers and mothers themselves, the intel of prayerlessness and neglect of God descended to their children also. Therefore they are where they are, and therefore it is with them and with their children as it is. My brethren, if prayer is anything at all, it is everything. And that is exactly what the whole Word of God says about prayer. It is everything, absolutely everything.